The forest was quiet, too quiet. Not the kind of peaceful quiet you'd hear in the early hours of dawn when the world was just beginning to stir, but the heavy, oppressive kind, the sort that warned you something was wrong. The trees, ancient and gnarled, stood like silent sentinels, their branches intertwining to form a canopy so dense that barely any light filtered through. The air carried a strange, metallic tang, faint but sharp enough to tickle the back of your throat. Something had happened here. He moved carefully through the underbrush, every step deliberate, every sense on high alert. His boots crunched softly against the damp earth, the sound almost swallowed by the stillness. The soldier wasn't supposed to be here. This area wasn't marked on any map he'd been given, and the higher-ups had warned against straying off designated paths. But the war had scattered everyone, and following protocols seemed far less important than survival now. His rifle hung loosely at his side, more of a comfort than a threat out here. That's when he heard it. It wasn't a loud sound, more like a faint whimper carried on the breeze, but it stopped him in his tracks. He strained his ears, heart thudding in his chest, as the sound came again, a low, pained cry, almost animal-like. No, not an animal. There was something too deliberate, too desperate in the tone. He couldn't ignore it, though every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to leave whatever it was behind and stay focused on finding his squad. Pushing aside a curtain of ferns, he stepped into a small clearing. What he saw made his breath catch. She was lying there, crumpled on the ground like a broken doll. Her body, if you could call it that, was a strange mix of human and something other. Long limbs, delicate and alien in their angles, twitched weakly as she struggled to move. Silvery blood pooled beneath her, shimmering faintly in the dim light. Her skin, was it some kind of armor, was torn and scorched in places, revealing intricate patterns of what looked like circuitry beneath. She wasn't human, that much was obvious. But what hit him hardest wasn't her appearance. It was her eyes. They were wide, impossibly large, and filled with a mix of pain, fear, and something else, a flicker of hope, maybe. Or perhaps she was just pleading for the end to come quickly. Either way, those eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, he felt like he was falling. For a second, he hesitated. This was alien territory, literally. He had no idea if she was friend or foe, no way of knowing if this was a trap or if helping her would make him an enemy of his own people. But then she made a sound, half a groan, half a whisper, and the raw agony in it cut through every doubt he had. He knelt beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly over her injuries. Up close, she looked even more fragile, her form trembling like a bird caught in a storm. "Hey," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the vastness of the forest. "Can you hear me?" Her gaze flickered to him, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she winced, her body curling in on itself as another wave of pain hit her. "I'm not going to hurt you," he continued, his tone gentle but firm. I need to see how bad it is, okay?" She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. Taking that as permission, or at least not outright refusal, he leaned closer, trying to assess the damage. Her injuries were unlike anything he'd seen before. The gashes in her body didn't bleed, like human wounds. Instead, that silvery liquid seeped out slowly, almost as if her body was rationing it. Her breaths were shallow, labored, and every now and then, a faint, static-like sound emanated from her, like a broken radio struggling to catch a signal. He ripped a piece of fabric from his sleeve, pressing it gently against the largest wound to try and stem the flow of whatever she was losing. She flinched at the contact, but didn't resist. "Who did this to you?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if she could even understand him. Her eyes darted around, frantic, and she made a weak gesture with her hand, or what looked like a hand toward the forest behind her. He turned his head, following her gaze, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Someone or something had hurt her, and if they were still nearby, he needed to get them both out of here, fast. "Okay," he said, more to himself than to her. "I'm going to get you out of here. Just hang on, all right?" Her expression didn't change, but the faintest flicker of trust seemed to pass over her features. Or maybe he was imagining it. Either way, he carefully slid one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her legs, lifting her as gently as he could. She was lighter than he expected, almost weightless, but every movement made her wince, and he could feel the tension. The forest seemed darker now, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of his boots and her shallow breathing. Every step felt like a gamble, every shadow like a potential threat. He didn't know where he was going, just away from here, away from whatever had left her like this. "Stay with me," he muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or himself. The weight of her in his arms, the strange warmth radiating from her, and the steady drip of her blood, or whatever it was, onto his uniform, were constant reminders of how fragile the situation was. He didn't know who she was, what she was, or why she was here, but he knew one thing for certain. She had been left for dead, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain. He couldn't let that be the end of her story. In the distance, a low rumbling sound echoed through the trees, faint but growing louder. He froze, his grip tightening instinctively around her. It was a sound he recognized all too well, the unmistakable hum of engines, military grade. The rumble grew louder, vibrating through the air and sending a cold jolt down his spine. It wasn't the kind of sound you could mistake, not when you'd been trained to listen for it. A military patrol. Maybe they were his own, but there was no way to be sure, not anymore. The forest had a way of twisting your sense of direction, and the fractured state of their forces after the last ambush left trust in short supply. If they weren't friendly, then being caught carrying an alien, especially one like this, wouldn't end well for either of them. He adjusted his grip on her and moved faster, weaving through the thick underbrush. The alien stirred faintly in his arms, her eyes fluttering open for a moment before closing again. Her breaths were shallow but steady, each one a small reassurance that she was still holding on. For now. The trees thinned out slightly ahead, revealing a rocky incline leading to higher ground. He didn't like the idea of being out in the open, but it was better than staying low where the sound of the engines seemed to echo louder. He climbed quickly, the uneven ground threatening to trip him with every step. She whimpered softly as he stumbled over a loose stone, the sound cutting straight through him. "Sorry," he muttered under his breath. Just a little further. Reaching the top of the incline, he spotted what he'd been hoping for, a cluster of boulders nestled against the side of a hill, forming a natural alcove. It wasn't perfect, but it would provide cover. He ducked into the space, setting her down as gently as he could. She winced as he pulled his hands away, her body curling slightly as if to shield herself from the world. Her silvery blood had slowed its flow, but the wound still looked raw, the edges sparking faintly with an energy he didn't understand. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He pressed his back against the rock, his rifle resting across his knees as he listened for the patrol. The engines were closer now, the hum punctuated by the occasional crackle of static, likely from their comms. He glanced back at her, his mind racing. Who was she? What was she? He'd fought in this war long enough to recognize the alien species they were up against, the towering, insectoid creatures with their razor-sharp limbs and unearthly screeches. She wasn't one of them. Her form was too delicate, her features too hauntingly human, despite the strange metallic sheen to her skin. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts, heavy boots crunching against the forest floor. He tensed, his grip tightening on his rifle. Through a small gap in the rocks, he saw them, 3 figures in full combat gear, their helmets sleek and faceless under the dim light. Their weapons were drawn, scanning the area as they moved in a tight formation.
His heart pounded as he pressed himself further into the shadows.
He knew how these patrols worked. They didn't ask questions, especially not in contested zones. If they found him, they'd shoot first and sort out the details later. One of the soldiers stopped, raising a hand to signal the others. They paused, their helmets tilting slightly, as if listening.
His pulse quickened.
Had they heard something? He glanced at her. She was completely still, her breathing shallow, but her eyes were open again, watching him. There was something in her gaze that made his chest tighten, a mix of fear and trust, as if she was silently begging him not to let them take her. The soldier who had stopped took a step closer, their head turning toward the rocks. He held his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger of his rifle. He didn't want to fire, didn't want to draw more attention, but if they got too close, he wouldn't have a choice. Then, just as the soldier raised their weapon, a distant sound echoed through the forest, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping under pressure. The soldier turned sharply toward the noise, gesturing for the others to follow. They moved quickly, their footsteps fading into the distance as they pursued whatever had caught their attention. He exhaled slowly, his muscles relaxing slightly, though the tension in his chest remained. That had been too close. Turning his attention back to her, he noticed her watching him intently, her expression softer now. It was strange, the way she seemed to focus on him, as if trying to understand something about him that even he didn't fully grasp. "Guess you're stuck with me for a bit longer," he said, his voice low. "Lucky you." She didn't respond, but her eyes flickered briefly, almost like she was acknowledging the attempt at humor. He leaned his head back against the rock, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The patrol would be back eventually, and staying here wasn't an option. He needed a plan, but every option felt like a gamble. A soft sound drew his attention, a faint, melodic hum coming from her. It was so quiet, he almost missed it, but as he leaned closer, he realized it wasn't just a sound. It was a signal. Her hand moved slightly, weakly, gesturing toward the device embedded in her chest. It was small, barely noticeable, amidst the intricate patterns of her body, but it pulsed faintly with light. "You're trying to tell me something," he said, frowning. "Is that some kind of beacon?" She made a faint noise, something between a sigh and a groan, and her hand fell back to her side. "A beacon," he muttered again, the realization dawning on him. It wasn't just a signal, it was a call for help. Whatever or whoever she was, she had backup, and they might already be looking for her. His stomach twisted at the thought. If her people showed up, would they see him as a savior or a threat? And what about his own? If they caught wind of this, would they brand him a traitor for helping her? The hum of the engines returned, distant but drawing closer. Time was running out. "All right," he said softly, his decision made. "If you've got a way out of this, I'll help you find it. But we've got to move." She blinked slowly, her gaze steady on his. There was no fear now, only a quiet determination that mirrored his own. He adjusted his grip on his rifle, then carefully lifted her again. She didn't protest, though her body tensed slightly as he moved. The forest stretched out before them, dark and uncertain. Whatever answers lay ahead, they'd have to face them together. And somewhere, deep in the trees, the engines roared louder, the hunt closing in. The forest felt alive with tension, every sound amplified in the soldier's ears as he carried her deeper into the shadows of the trees. The engines were closing in, the low rumble of machinery cutting through the otherwise stifling quiet. He tried to move quickly, but the uneven terrain slowed him down, each step a battle to keep his balance while keeping her from slipping out of his arms. She was getting weaker. Her breathing had grown faint, her body trembling with each jolt. He could feel the heat radiating from her, unnatural and unsettling, as though whatever energy was keeping her alive was slipping away. He glanced down at her, trying to gauge how much longer she could last. Her eyes remained half open, the dim glow behind them flickering like a candle on the verge of being snuffed out. "Stay with me," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the crunch of leaves underfoot. "Just a little further." The words felt hollow. He had no idea where he was going. There was no map for this, no clear path to safety. All he knew was that he had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of the patrol and hope that anything would present itself. Behind him, the engines grew louder, joined now by the faint crackle of voices over comms. They were organized, methodical, sweeping the area in search patterns. He knew they'd find the traces he'd left behind soon enough, the disturbed underbrush, the faint trail of silvery blood. It wouldn't take them long to close the gap. He stumbled into another clearing, his breath catching as he scanned the area. The trees were thinner here, the open space leaving them dangerously exposed. He didn't have time to backtrack, though. He could already hear the faint crunch of boots somewhere behind him. She stirred in his arms, a faint, pained sound escaping her lips. He paused, lowering her slightly to get a better look. Her hand twitched weakly, reaching toward the device embedded in her chest. The soft, rhythmic hum from earlier had grown erratic, the light flickering faster, as though it was responding to her condition. "You're trying to tell me something again, aren't you?" he said quietly, kneeling to set her down against a tree. Her gaze met his, the intensity in her eyes surprising him despite her obvious weakness. She made a faint gesture toward the device, her fingers brushing against it before falling limp again. "Okay," he said, swallowing hard. "I'll figure it out. Just hang on." His hands hovered over the device, unsure where to even begin. It looked like part of her body, seamlessly integrated into her form. Yet it pulsed with a life of its own. Tentatively, he pressed a finger against the edge of it. The response was immediate. The device emitted a sharp, high-pitched tone, the light flaring brightly for a split second before dimming again. She winced, but didn't pull away, her breathing growing shallower as the tone continued. "Come on," he muttered, his fingers fumbling against the smooth surface. "What do you need me to do?" A distant shout cut through the forest, sharp and commanding. His head snapped up, heart pounding as he realized just how close the patrol was now. They were almost on top of him. Desperation clawed at him as he turned his attention back to her. He pressed his palm flat against the device, hoping for some kind of reaction. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a faint click, a panel on the device slid open, revealing a small, glowing interface. Her hand moved again, weakly gesturing toward the open panel. He hesitated, glancing between her and the forest around them. The voices were closer now, the faint rustling of leaves signaling the approach of the soldiers. "I hope this doesn't kill us both," he muttered before pressing his fingers against the interface. The reaction was immediate. A surge of energy shot through the device, and for a brief moment, the air around them seemed to hum with power. The glow from the device brightened, casting eerie patterns against the trees as the forest fell silent. Then, as quickly as it had started, the light dimmed again, and the hum faded. He looked down at her, his heart sinking as he realized nothing had changed. If anything, she seemed weaker now, her body slackening as her eyes fluttered closed. "No, no, no," he said, his voice shaking. He shook her gently, trying to keep her conscious. "Stay with me. You can't give up now." A loud crash behind him sent him spinning around, his rifle snapping up instinctively. One of the soldiers had broken through the tree line, their weapon raised as their visor locked onto him. "Drop the weapon," the soldier barked, their voice distorted through the helmet's speaker. He froze, his mind racing. If he dropped his rifle, he'd be defenseless. If he didn't, they'd shoot. And then there was her lying so still behind him, vulnerable and exposed. "Put it down," the soldier shouted again, stepping closer. Before he could make a decision, a sudden deafening noise ripped through the clearing. The ground trembled beneath him, and a blinding light erupted from the device on her chest. The soldier stumbled back, their weapon wavering as they tried to shield their eyes. The light intensified, spreading outward in waves that seemed to distort the very air around them. He turned back to her, his breath catching as he saw her body lifting slightly off the ground, her form bathed in the same brilliant light. What the soldier began, but their words were lost as the light pulsed again, sending a shockwave through the clearing. He felt himself thrown backward, the impact knocking the wind out of him as he hit the ground. For a moment, everything was chaos, blinding light, deafening noise, and the unmistakable sense that something far beyond his understanding was unfolding right in front of him. When the light finally began to fade, he blinked, his vision swimming as he tried to make sense of what had happened. The soldier was gone, their weapon lying discarded on the ground. The air was still again, the oppressive quiet of the forest returning as if nothing had happened. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. She was still lying where he had left her, but something was different now. The device on her chest was glowing steadily, its hum soft and rhythmic once more. She opened her eyes slowly, her gaze meeting his. There was strength in her expression now, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. "What just happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know. Whatever had just occurred, it was far from over. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next move, and deep in the distance, the engines roared back to life. The stillness in the forest felt unnatural, as if the world itself had paused to process what had just happened. The glow from the device on her chest was steady now, its rhythmic pulse casting faint shadows across her form. She pushed herself upright with effort, her movements slow but deliberate. He watched her cautiously, unsure of what to say or do. You okay?" he asked, his voice breaking the fragile silence. She nodded faintly, though her expression remained unreadable. There was something different about her now. She didn't look as fragile as before, though she was still visibly weak. Her gaze held a strange intensity, her eyes scanning their surroundings with a focus that hadn't been there moments ago. Before he could say anything else, a distant sound broke through the quiet, the unmistakable hum of engines, but this time, it wasn't coming from behind them. He turned, straining to pinpoint the direction, his heart sinking as he realized it was coming from above. He looked up, his breath catching as he spotted it, a sleek, dark vessel cutting through the canopy, its silhouette almost invisible against the dim sky. It wasn't one of theirs. The design was too alien, too advanced. "Is that your people?" he asked her, keeping his voice low. Her expression shifted, a flicker of something passing across her face. Relief? Fear? He couldn't tell. She reached out weakly, her hand grasping his sleeve as she tried to pull herself to her feet. He helped her up, his grip firm but careful. The ship hovered overhead, its presence a stark reminder that whatever had happened with the device had sent a signal. But to who? The engines from the patrol behind them grew louder again, the soldiers clearly regrouping and closing in. He glanced between her and the approaching threat, his mind racing. Staying here was no longer an option. "We need to move," he said, his voice firm. "If that's your ride, we need to get to it before they do." She nodded, her steps unsteady but determined as they started moving again. The ship above them shifted slightly, its engines emitting a low whine as it adjusted its position. It wasn't landing, at least not yet, but it was definitely tracking them. They pushed deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser and the underbrush thicker. The sound of the patrol behind them was closer now, the shouts of soldiers cutting through the hum of engines. As they neared a small clearing, he froze, pulling her behind him as his eyes caught movement ahead. Another figure stepped into view, their form silhouetted against the faint light filtering through the trees. This one wasn't a soldier. The figure was tall and humanoid, but there was something distinctly alien about them. Their features were sharp and angular, their skin shimmering faintly like hers, but darker, almost metallic. They were unarmed, their hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. She stepped forward instinctively, her body swaying slightly as if drawn to the newcomer. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Wait," he said, his voice low. "We don't know if they're friendly." The alien spoke, their voice calm but unfamiliar, the words flowing in a language he couldn't understand. She responded weakly, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a tone of recognition. "Friend?" he asked, glancing at her. She nodded faintly, her gaze fixed on the alien. The moment was shattered by the sharp crack of a rifle shot. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat as he spotted the source, one of the soldiers, their weapon raised as they stepped into the clearing. "No," he shouted, raising his own rifle and firing back. The shot went wide, but it was enough to force the soldier to take cover. The alien in the clearing moved suddenly, their form a blur as they darted toward her. He raised his weapon instinctively, but froze when he saw the alien kneel beside her, their movements careful and deliberate. The device on her chest flared to life again, the glow intensifying as the alien placed their hands over it. She gasped, her body tensing as a surge of energy coursed through her. "What's happening?" he demanded, his voice rising as he backed toward them, his rifle still trained on the soldiers advancing through the trees. The alien didn't respond, their focus entirely on her. The light from the device grew brighter, its hum growing louder until it was almost deafening. The soldiers weren't deterred. They pressed forward, their weapons trained on the group in the clearing. He fired again, the shot hitting one of them in the leg and sending them sprawling. But there were too many. "Whatever you're doing," he said, glancing back at the alien, "you better do it fast." The alien finished whatever they were doing, the light from the device dimming slightly as they pulled their hands away. She opened her eyes, her breathing steadier now, and for the first time she looked almost whole. The alien turned to him, speaking quickly in their unfamiliar tongue. He shook his head, frustration mounting. "I don't understand you." She touched his arm, her voice soft but clear. "They're here to help." He hesitated, his grip on his rifle tightening as the soldiers closed in. "How do I know that?" he asked, his voice edged with doubt. Before she could answer, The aliens stepped forward, their forms shifting slightly as they raised one hand. The air around them shimmered, and a barrier of light sprang up between them and the advancing soldiers. The soldiers fired, their bullets disintegrating as they hit the barrier. He stared in disbelief, lowering his weapon slightly. "Okay," he muttered. "I guess that's one way to prove it." The alien gestured for them to follow, their movements urgent. She gripped his arm, pulling him toward the path ahead. The roar of the ship's engines grew louder, the vessel descending through the canopy. The light from its thrusters illuminated the forest, casting long shadows as it hovered above the clearing. But the soldiers weren't giving up. One of them threw something, a small, cylindrical object that landed just beyond the barrier. "Grenade!" he shouted, diving for cover as the explosion rocked the clearing. The barrier flickered but held, though cracks of light began to spread through it like fractured glass. The alien barked something unintelligible, their tone sharp and commanding. The ship responded, a beam of light shooting down from its undercarriage and enveloping the group. For a moment, everything dissolved into blinding brightness. The forest, the soldiers, the chaos, all of it faded as the beam consumed them. And then, just as suddenly, the light disappeared, leaving nothing but empty space in its wake. The light faded, and for a moment there was nothing but an overwhelming silence. He blinked, his vision adjusting slowly, and realized they were no longer in the forest. The dense trees, the patrols, the hum of approaching engines, all of it was gone. Instead, they stood in a vast chamber, the walls smooth and seamless, glowing faintly with a soft, silvery light. The air was still, unnervingly so, and carried a faint, metallic tang. He glanced around, his heart still pounding as he tried to make sense of their new surroundings. She stood beside him, her posture steadier than it had been in hours. The alien who had helped her was nearby, their form silhouetted against the shimmering walls, as they began to manipulate a console that seemed to grow directly out of the floor. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice echoing faintly. She turned to him, her gaze steady, but her expression unreadable. "A sanctuary," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of weariness. "At least, it was supposed to be." Her words sent a chill down his spine. There was something in her tone that made him feel like the danger wasn't over. Before he could press her further, the alien turned toward them, speaking in its strange, fluid language. She listened, nodding slightly before translating. "We've been taken aboard their vessel. This is their command chamber. They detected the signal from my device and came to retrieve me, but they didn't expect the human soldiers to be so close." "Retrieve you?" he repeated, frowning. "For what?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping for a moment. "To finish what I was sent here to do." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. "What does that mean?" Before she could answer, the chamber shuddered violently, the floor beneath them trembling as a low, ominous rumble filled the air. The alien at the console worked quickly, their hands moving with precision as they barked a series of sharp calls. "They found us," she said, her voice grim. "Who?" "The human forces," she replied, her gaze meeting his. "They're firing on the ship." His stomach dropped. He hadn't thought it possible for them to track the vessel, let alone launch an attack so quickly. The alien ship might have been advanced, but it wasn't untouchable. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken acknowledgement that they were running out of time. The alien gestured toward another console, and she moved to it without hesitation, her hands brushing over the smooth surface. A display appeared, showing a view of the forest below, where several heavily armed human vehicles were taking position. He recognized the insignias instantly. This wasn't just a patrol anymore. This was a full strike team. "They think you're a threat," he said, his voice heavy. "They're not going to stop until they destroy this ship." She didn't look at him, her focus entirely on the console. "They're not wrong." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. He stared at her, struggling to process what she'd just said. "What are you talking about?" She paused, her fingers hovering over the console as she turned to face him. "I wasn't sent here to escape or to seek refuge," she said quietly. "I was sent to activate the device to signal my people that this planet is ready for occupation." His blood ran cold. "Occupation?" She nodded, her expression solemn. "The device wasn't just a beacon. It's a marker. My people are coming, and when they arrive, they'll eliminate any resistance to secure the planet. It's already in motion. There's nothing that can stop it now." His mind reeled, his chest tightening as the weight of her words sank in. You're saying this was all a setup? You let me save you, protect you, and now you're telling me it was all for nothing?" "It wasn't for nothing," she said, her voice soft. "You saved me. You gave me a chance to see this world, to understand it in a way I never could before. And because of that, I know there's something worth protecting here." Her words only confused him further. "Protecting? You just said your people are coming to take over." "They are," she said, her gaze steady. "But it doesn't have to happen like this." The chamber shook again, harder this time, and the alien at the console barked another command. She turned back to the console, her hands moving quickly as she worked. "What are you doing?" he asked, stepping closer. "Overriding the signal," she said. "If I can shut it down, my people won't have a marker to follow. They'll delay their arrival, maybe even call off the mission entirely." He frowned. "Won't they just send another beacon?" "Not if they think this one was sabotaged," she said. "It'll buy time, at least." The idea sounded insane, and yet he could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't lying, at least not about this. The chamber shuddered again, and a loud alarm blared, the sound echoing through the space. The alien at the console turned to her, their tone urgent as they spoke. "They're breaching the ship's defenses," she said grimly. "We don't have much time." He looked at her, his mind racing. "And what happens to you if you do this? Won't your people know you were involved?" She hesitated, her gaze softening. "They will, and they'll consider me a traitor." The weight of her words hit him like a blow. She was risking everything, her life, her people, her mission, all for a planet that wasn't even hers. The alien barked another command, and she nodded before turning to him. "You need to leave," she said firmly. "There's an escape pod down the corridor. It'll take you far enough away to be safe." "I'm not leaving you here," he said, his voice firm. "You have to," she insisted. "If I fail, this ship will be destroyed, and you'll die with it." The urgency in her tone left no room for argument, but he still hesitated. He'd come this far, fought so hard to keep her alive. Walking away now felt impossible. The chamber shook violently, sparks flying from one of the consoles as the alarm grew louder. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Go," she said, her voice breaking. "You've already done enough. More than I could have ever asked for." He looked at her, his heart heavy as he realized there was no other choice. Nodding reluctantly, he turned and ran toward the corridor she'd pointed to, his chest tight with every step. As he reached the pod, he paused, glancing back one last time. She was still at the console, her figure illuminated by the flickering light of the device on her chest. And then the pod door sealed, and everything went dark. When the pod launched, the ship was already a distant speck in the sky. Moments later, a brilliant flash lit up the horizon as the ship exploded, its pieces scattering like stars across the heavens. He sat in stunned silence, the weight of everything pressing down on him. She'd made her choice, and so had he. But as the pod drifted toward the surface, a faint signal lit up on the console in front of him, a message encoded in a language he didn't understand. And for a brief moment, he swore he saw her face, her eyes filled with quiet resolve, before the screen went dark. The pod hurtled through the atmosphere, its hull trembling with the intensity of re-entry. He sat, strapped in the seat, his fists clenched tightly around the restraints. Outside, the world was a blur of fire and shadow, and all he could hear was the deafening roar of the descent. But none of it registered. His thoughts were fixed on her, on the sacrifice she had made, the choices that had led them to this moment, and the faint, fleeting image of her face that had appeared before the screen went dark. The pod jolted violently as it slowed, its parachutes deploying with a sharp hiss. The world outside began to take shape, the dense greens of the forest below filling his view. The same forest where everything had started, and now where everything had ended. The pod landed with a heavy thud, throwing up dirt and leaves as it came to rest. For a moment, he sat there, breathing heavily as the silence closed in around him. Then, slowly, he unbuckled himself and pushed the hatch open. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of rain. He climbed out of the pod, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The forest stretched out around him, unchanged by the chaos that had unfolded above. It felt surreal to be back, as if time itself had bent in some inexplicable way. He looked up at the sky, now clear and calm, with no trace of the battle that had taken place. It was over, or at least it should have been. But as he stood there, the faint memory of the message that had appeared in the pod flickered in his mind. He didn't understand the symbols, but the image of her face, that brief, almost ghostly moment, felt too deliberate to dismiss. Was it a goodbye? A warning? Or something else entirely? He didn't have answers, and for now, he wasn't sure they mattered. He needed to move. The forest wasn't safe, not with the soldiers still searching for remnants of the alien ship. He had no idea how much time had passed since he'd been ejected, but he knew the patrols wouldn't have given up. Grabbing the survival pack stashed in the pod, he began walking, his steps careful and deliberate as he made his way through the dense underbrush. As he moved, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on him. She'd called herself a traitor, but he didn't see her that way. She had chosen to protect a world that wasn't hers, to stand against her own people for reasons he couldn't fully understand. And yet, her actions had bought him and everyone else a chance. Whether it was days, months, or years, the invasion she had warned him about was delayed, and that delay meant hope. He pressed on, the hours blurring together as he navigated the forest. The sounds of wildlife surrounded him, a stark contrast to the chaos he'd left behind. It was almost peaceful, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. The questions gnawed at him, pulling him back to the moments in the ship, the decisions she had made, and the things she hadn't said. By the time he reached the edge of the forest, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. A small town lay in the distance, its lights flickering like beacons in the growing darkness. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of everything threatening to hold him back. But he couldn't stop now. He needed to keep moving, to find his way back to some semblance of normalcy, if such a thing even existed anymore. The town was quiet when he arrived, its streets nearly empty as the last remnants of daylight faded. He kept his head down, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would say, how he could explain everything that had happened. But as he approached the outskirts, he realized no one was watching him. The people here didn't know about the ship, the patrols, or the beacon that had almost brought destruction to their world. To them, he was just another traveler, another face passing through. It was both a relief and a burden. The knowledge he carried, the things he had seen, none of it could be shared, not without risking more questions, more danger. He found a small inn at the edge of town and paid for a room with what little he had left. The innkeeper barely glanced at him, their tired eyes betraying no suspicion. Once inside, he locked the door and sat on the bed, his head in his hands as the exhaustion finally caught up to him. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of the ship, the soldiers, and her face, always her face, hovering just out of reach. He woke before dawn, the faint light of morning filtering through the curtains. For a moment, he just lay there, staring at the ceiling as the weight of reality settled back over him. He couldn't stay here. He didn't know where he would go or what he would do, but staying in one place felt wrong. There was too much at stake, too much he didn't understand. He gathered his things and slipped out of the inn before anyone else was awake, the cool morning air biting at his skin as he began walking again. The days that followed were a blur of movement and silence. He avoided major roads, keeping to the wilderness as much as possible. The few times he encountered other people, he kept his interactions brief, offering vague answers to their questions before moving on. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he felt driven by an unshakable need to keep going, to find some kind of closure or at least clarity. It wasn't until weeks later that he finally stopped running. He found himself on a hill overlooking a wide valley, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and red. He sat there, the quiet wrapping around him like a blanket, and let himself breathe. For the first time since the ship, he allowed himself to feel the weight of it all, the loss, the uncertainty, the impossible choices. And then, as the first stars began to appear in the sky, he noticed something. A faint light, flickering in the distance. It wasn't a star, nor was it a plane or a satellite. It was too irregular, too deliberate. He stared at it, his heart pounding as a strange sense of recognition washed over him. The light pulsed once, then again, its rhythm unmistakable. It was the same as the device she had worn, the same as the beacon that had drawn her people to this planet. But this time, it wasn't a threat. It was a message. He didn't know how he knew, but he felt it deep in his bones. She was alive. Somehow, against all odds, she had survived. And this light, this faint, flickering signal, was her way of letting him know. Tears blurred his vision as he stared at the light, a wave of emotions crashing over him. Relief, hope, and something he couldn't quite name. She had made her choice, and now so had he. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew he wouldn't face it alone. The light continued to pulse, steady and unyielding, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a way forward. And as he sat there, watching the stars come alive in the night sky, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace.